Right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Neil Redfern. I'm the Executive Director at the Council for British Archaeology. And tonight we have a special evening with the Portable Antiquities Scheme to help celebrate the CBA's Festival of Archaeology, which is running over the 2 weeks between the 13th of July and the 28th of July. I'm delighted tonight to be joined by Michael Lewis, Rob Webley, Ed Caswell, and Ben Westwood, who are all going to talk to you about the amazing and brilliant Portable Antiquities Scheme. As ever with our Zoom webinars, if you have a question for our amazing panel, could you use the Q&A function? I will come back at the end of their presentations and host the question session with them. So all your questions in there we can put to Michael, Rob, Ed, and Ben. Obviously, please feel free to use the chat if you've got any other issues you might want to pick up, or if you want to say anything to anyone else. But for actual questions to the panel, could you please use the Q&A? So our panelists are all going to talk in turn, and then I'm going to come back at the end and host the Q&A session. So right now, what I'd like to do is hand over to Michael Lewis, who's going to kick off tonight's presentations. Michael, welcome. Thank you for doing this, and I look forward to hearing how you all get on.
Thanks very much, Neil, and we're very grateful, of course, to CBA for allowing us to speak about the Portable Antiquities Scheme. So I'm Michael Lewis, I'm Head of Portable Antiquities and Treasure at the British Museum. Rob Webley is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Reading, who previously was a Finds Liaison Officer. Ed Caswell is the current Finds Liaison Officer for Oxfordshire, and Ben Westwood is the Finds Liaison Officer for County Durham. So as Neil said, we're going to talk in turn, and I'm going to try and share my screen now and hope it works. Okay, just bear with me a second. Hopefully you can all see that fine. So too many finds, too few recorders. Well, apologies if this sounds like a bit of a downbeat assessment of where we are with recording finds discovered by the public, most of which are found, of course, by the metal detecting community. But I hope that by the end of this session, you'll see that we have a fantastic opportunity to involve more people in archaeology, which I hope will interest CBA members and supporters, as well as all of us learn more about the past. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of the problem and the possible solutions, I should give a quick overview of what the Portable Antiquities Scheme is for those that are less familiar with it. The Portable Antiquities Scheme was established alongside the reform of treasure legislation in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, which led to the Treasure Act 1996. I won't go into what treasure is, apart from to say its principal focus is on precious metal items, hoards, and now finds of special interest. What is key for us, however, is the Act only protects a relatively small proportion of finds. And so the Portable Antiquities Scheme was established in England and Wales as a system for recording the rest, i.e. non-treasure finds, but on a voluntary basis. All four of us are or have been Finds Liaison Officers, the front line of the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which liaises with the public to encourage them to hand over finds for recording. This data is added to the Portable Antiquities Scheme database, the principal mechanism for making these finds available for archaeological works, for research, and just for anyone who has a general interest in archaeological finds. Anyone can access this data at www.finds.org.uk, though we only make the full data, the full find spot data, I should say, available to those who need it for research. This is to protect archaeological sites from illegal metal detecting. The Finds Liaison Officer's job is to record these finds, knowing that if they're not recorded, then they'll be lost from the archaeological record forever. Key is recording the find spot, as without the find, the find has limited archaeological value. Indeed, the Portable Antiquities Scheme requires that good find spots for all recorded finds. Invariably, then, it's a one-off opportunity, as usually only the finder has this information. However, given there are maybe over 40,000 detectorists in the UK and 40 finds liaison officers, it's not practical for finds liaison officers to record all the finds that the public make. Therefore, as Ed and Ben will explain in more detail, finds liaison officers are necessarily more selective in what they record. Invariably, these decisions on what to record and what not to record will mean that there are biases added to the dataset. It could be argued that all archaeological works sample data, but obviously how these decisions are made will impact on the research value of the dataset. As Rob will explain in more detail, Portable Antiquities Scheme finds are essential for learning about the past. And besides everyday archaeological works, the data has been used in multiple research projects. In fact, any research on metal finds in particular, or finds within a landscape context, is now, in my view, possible without using Portable Antiquities Scheme data. This is especially the case because PAS finds are mainly from rural places unlikely to be investigated by archaeologists. And they offer different evidence about our past than information gleaned from sites surveyed and excavated by professional archaeologists. In short, the ways archaeologists and detectorists choose and investigate sites are very different, but they also complement each other. To address this challenge of too many finds and too few recorders, we are seeking to do several things. Firstly, and importantly, we are looking to work more closely with the metal detecting community. Several years ago, we had a Heritage Lottery Fund project called Past Explorers, finds recording in the local community, which gave us the resources to train volunteers to work alongside finds liaison officers. An essential part of this project were our self-recorders, metal detectorists trained to use the Portable Antiquities Scheme database to record their own finds. We are now looking to invigorate self-recording, not only because it helps us record more finds, but just as importantly, it's rewarding for those detectorists who want to do this work. To that end, we're also keen for more people to be involved from the wider community in helping us record more finds. This work might suit, for example, members of the CBA. I've long imagined, had a vision if you like, that we could partner detectorists with community volunteers who together could explore and record landscapes in a manner that ensures information is properly recorded, highlighted and shared. Maybe this could even a plan for what might happen to the finds made for the benefit of the wider community. If you like, landscape investigations led from those on the ground. Secondly, we want to make finds recording easier. A particular gripe of the detecting community is that the Portable Antiquities Scheme is too slow in recording finds. Of course, if there's a ratio of just one finds liaison officer to 1,000 finders, and that's just including the metal detecting community, so assuming a single finds liaison officer records about 1,000 finds a year, then it's only one find per finder that we have the resources to record. Obviously, the average detectorist records many more finds than that. In reality, fewer people, about 2,000 to 3,000 a year, offer most of the 50,000 to 60,000 finds we record on average. So we're missing out on many people and also many finds. So the choice seems simple to me: record fewer finds or record more in other ways. Thankfully, new technology is already making it easier for finders and finds liaison officers to record more finds. It's now easier for people to photograph their finds than ever before, in a way that we want them to. And recording apps also make it easier for finders to record the all-important find spot information whilst out in the field. We are also currently rebuilding the Portable Antiquities Scheme database, and it makes sense to build upon these advancements to record more finds, but also create better records. As it stands, the Portable Antiquities database is cumbersome to use as a recording tool. So we're looking at what improvements could be made to simplify the recording process and make it more user-friendly, especially for third parties. In short, I'd like it to be easier for finders to log details about common finds, so the finds liaison officer resource can be redirected towards the most unusual and complex finds. But it also makes it a more usable tool for anyone interested in archaeological finds. That said, maintaining the integrity of the data is essential for it to remain valuable as a research tool. This is harder said than done, even with technological advancements. But surely it's the way forward. Personally, I see democratizing archaeology for all as important, not only to address the practical challenge of too many finds and too few recorders, but to ensure that everyone has equal stake in learning about the past through archaeological finds. I'm now going to hand over to Rob Webley.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good evening, everyone. As I share my screen, I'd like to say again, thank you to Michael for his kind introduction. Thank you to you all for joining us tonight. Tonight, I'd like to share some of the research that Michael mentioned that I've done over recent years using the PAS database, focusing on the medieval period. As Michael said, I've worked for the PAS starting nearly 20 years ago now, and have since been fortunate enough to work using its data in a number of ways. So I did a PhD, which primarily used PAS data. I am currently working, as Michael said, at the University of Reading as a postdoc on a project called the Medieval Ritual Landscape. We're looking at medieval lived religion and the objects people used in their daily life. Lots of PAS data there. I also worked prior to that on a project called Warhorse, and it's Warhorse that I'd like to talk a little bit to you about tonight. First, a little bit on using PAS data as a researcher. And as Michael said, there are kind of two ways one can really use PAS data. As he mentioned, one is place specific. So taking a locality or wider area and investigating the landscape using PAS data alongside, of course, all sorts of other types of archaeological information. The other is more typological, focusing instead on a particular object type or a group of objects and investigating that in time and in space. And the point I wanted to make here is that both of these approaches benefit from the sheer quantity of data amassed by the PAS since it started in 1997. Because once you start breaking down its 1.1 million records, as we just saw, into specific object types, or by considering particular places, you still need a critical mass of data to work with. And as Michael said already, anyone can register with the PAS and you can download data from its database by so doing. And to get those, get more precise geographical data, you can apply for an enhanced access as a researcher, and that's exactly what Warhorse did. So Warhorse was an AHRC funded project that began in, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with my presentation here, moving it on. So I'm going to come out and go back in. I do apologize. Warhorse started in 2019 and went through to last year. And it was led by academics from the University of Exeter and the University of East Anglia. Hopefully you can see some of them there. One of our main premises was the iconic medieval warhorse had been studied primarily through historical rather than archaeological evidence. We not only aimed to rectify this, but adopted an explicitly multidisciplinary approach. So I found myself working as part of a team which included historians, zooarchaeologists, and even geneticists. And when it came to looking at the potential of the PAS dataset, it turned out to be huge, to have huge numbers of relevant material. You can see from the totals at the bottom of this table, we're talking about many thousands of items of horse equipment that the PAS has recorded. and these numbers are growing all the time. However, you may also spot that if horse armour is essential to any warhorse study, then the PAS database is not the place to be looking for it. And the same goes for other objects of iron, such as horseshoes. And this is mainly because metal detectorists, who tend to find most of this material, discriminate against ironwork, in part because of its poor survival in the plough zone. So for the Warhorse project, I had to play to the strengths of the PAS dataset, which includes the over 6,000 harness pendants that feature on this table, and which I'm going to talk about for the rest of my time. So first, let me introduce you to harness pendants. As the name suggests, small copper alloy swinging plates such as this were used to decorate horse harness, with a major fashion for their use extending from the 12th century to the 14th. They were formed of a mount, which you can see at the top, from which, and that was riveted to a leather harness strap, from which hung a plate, here the shield shape, hung and swung. Harness pendants could come in many different forms, the shield shape being one of the most common. And while they could be decorated in a variety of ways, many were decorated with heraldic devices, as here. And when you can work out whose arms are being shown on a pendant, you can start to do some interesting things, as I hope to set out in a moment. Pendants like the one we just saw were used at various locations on the medieval horse. And we know this primarily from pictorial evidence. Mostly they were located on the horse's breastband, as also shown on this image from a manuscript of circa 1250. Such depictions can give a sense of the quantities of pendants involved, and therefore the kind of visual and oral impact these objects would have made. Imagine them catching the light, and also imagine the soundscape. Very, very exceptionally, in the archaeological record, we get survivals of leatherwork to confirm or perhaps confound our sense of the kinds of numbers of objects involved. This fabulous leather breastband was found relatively recently in a well in County Cork. It preserved the remains of no fewer than 48 harness pendant sets on just one strap. Now, one question I was able to consider through Warhorse relates to the social status of harness pendants in this period. Were they, as has been argued, relatively lowly objects used by servants or retainers of lordly households? Or on the other hand, should we associate them with knightly society, as has been assumed perhaps most strongly on the continent? I hope to contribute to this debate by considering the large subset of heraldic pendants from the later 13th and early 14th century that can be identified to a given family. And it's the PAS dataset for the first time that allows us to start to do this on a national basis. Previously, we just had too few. I piloted my approach by isolating examples of the Doboon family. The Doboons were Earls of Hereford and Essex until their line went extinct in 1372. You may be able to see from the pendant that their arms comprised 6 rampant gold lions, divided by a diagonal stripe on a blue background. Thanks to the PAS data, I could plot not just pendants, the blue dots here on this map, but also studs that we think were probably used as part of equestrian equipment, the red dots. While there's a strong showing of material in their earldoms of Herefordshire and Essex and around their various castles, the distribution of material is very well spread across the whole country, as befitted a family of national importance. Duly encouraged by this, I next examined material relating to the de Valence family. This family came to England in 1247 in the person of William de Lusignan, Lord of Valence, and his son, Aymer de Valence, became Earl of Pembroke and died in 1324 without heirs. Their decorative material features an inset border of little red birds on a ground of blue and silver horizontal stripes. What I recognised was missing from my Doboon study was any consideration of the familial residences and estates beyond the major family seats. So on this map, the yellow dots represent the smaller local properties alongside the castles. And when I plotted the pendants in blue, along with the rather fewer studs in red, only a couple turned out to be located near the family castles, such as one near Castle Acre in Norfolk, that's number 5. The majority of material seemed to fall between the castles, but within a zone defined broadly by the other smaller properties. Whether this implies traffic between the smaller holdings or around a local base, the restricted distribution for a family otherwise very prominent and active in national and international politics suggested to me that these harness pendants were indeed being used primarily as family identifiers by local retainers. And by way of a final example, here are harness decorations relating to the de Ferrers family on the PAS. The de Ferrers were Earls of Derby until 1279 and thereafter Barons of Chartley in Staffordshire. Their arms are heraldically called Vary, Or and Gules, and they comprise a red and gold pattern of interlocking parts. There was actually a heraldic fur based on squirrel fur. And to the right, you can see a fur-lined cloak worn by a rider on an early 12th century image. Note also the bells on the horse's breastband, but enough of squirrels. Amongst a very few items on the PAS database is a group of 4 objects from the vicinity of Bicester in Oxfordshire. It's that little cluster towards the middle. And that comprised 2 lozengiform harness pendants in the middle, something we call a rotating banner to the left, and a shield-shaped pendant, arguably of the same family. And what the local finds liaison officer who recorded them established was that the Earl of Derby was also Lord of the Manor of Market End in Bicester. So again, this points to a localized function, presumably used by the Bicester de Ferrers household. And to change tack, if you will, as part of Warhorse, I also considered medieval tournament sites. There are many reasons why these sites are not readily tractable through PAS data, often due to modern construction and search permissions. But one site did show particular promise when I plotted relative proportions of harness pendants against other items of horse equipment, and that's the red hexagon labelled number 1 here. This is the tournament site of Blythe Tickhill on the historic border of Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire, from which, incidentally, a few doubloon items have been recorded. In short, when I mapped the equestrian finds and the heraldic material in particular, here in green and pink, the heraldic material did not tend to cluster in the area of the tournament site itself, and that's number 4 in the middle here. But rather it clustered around the pole settlements of Blythe and Tickhill. Again, this perhaps suggests that this is where the retainers were active, people like squires, servants, and marshals, seeking local accommodation or setting up temporary tournament lodgings. So overall, based on this research, I would argue that at the height of heraldic decoration in the years around 1300, harness pendants were being mostly used by retainers and by servants. Knights and lords, on the other hand, were more likely to be using larger heraldic objects such as shields, banners, and caparisons, the last being decorated cloth coverings for their tournament or war horses. And I'd stress that none of the analysis presented just now would have been possible without PAS data. And my hope is that the objects the PAS records will continue to make a strong contribution to our understanding of the medieval world, my point of view, of course, many other periods in history, in conjunction, of course, with all the other available strands of evidence. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for listening to me, and I'm delighted to pass over to Dr. Ed Caswell, Oxfordshire Finds Liaison Officer, as we step back in time and go to the Bronze Age.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Rob. All right, I will just set up my screen sharing. So hopefully you can all see the presentation now. Brilliant. Well, thank you for that presentation, Rob. That was awesome. Yep. So my name's Ed. I'm the Finds Liaison Officer for Oxfordshire. So in this presentation, we're going to be talking about the Portable Antiquities Scheme's finds in a landscape context. And we're going to do this using 2 case studies of some of my research I've been doing. The first really demonstrates the scale of landscapes now visible just in the PAS database itself, and crucially, the extent to which these are extending every year. The second one, after saying, well, look, we've got loads of data, really presents just one way that we can use this large amount of data to better understand past landscapes. So the first of these case studies was generated when I was doing a little bit of research into our output as the scheme in Oxfordshire itself. So a bit of a confession at this point. I quite like to look at stats data to see if we're doing a good job or not. And the good news in Oxfordshire, yeah, it's fantastic. We're doing a huge amount of finds recording. So this year already, we've recorded 1,500 records. So we're on track to record over 2,000 from the county. And you'll see in that graph in sort of the middle of your screen there that the number of finds really is just going up and up and up. And that same's true for treasure cases. We had 75 alone last year. But there is one area where I'm not doing as well in the numbers as we have in previous years, and that's in the number of unique finders who are recording finds with us. Now, we know the reason for that. My predecessor covered 2 counties, so there were more metal detectors from a wider area reporting finds, but also they were able to attend rallies. So anyone not familiar with those, rallies are essentially big collections of metal detectorists, sometimes over 1,000, all culminating in particular locations and then heavily metal detecting that area. Now, my predecessor was able to, with the capacity they had, to go out and record finds from these, usually 1 or 2 from about 300 individuals. So that really boosted the number of people that were recording with the scheme in the county at that time. But that got us thinking, saying, well, are we worried about that or not? Because if they're metal detecting just in that really clustered space, you can see that on the graph there in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, are we just learning the same information about the areas which are already being heavily metal detected? Are we really losing anything along those lines? And it was that we wanted to test by just doing a little bit of research about where finds are being discovered and if those are new areas. So we tried to do this initially on a parish level, and we were a bit victims of our own success, really, in that we've got so many parishes in Oxfordshire, it makes it hard to do that kind of analysis. So we've got 323 parishes, and only 14 of those don't have a record on the PAS database, which is fantastic. It means most of the county is covered by records on the database. Now, if you have a look at those maps, you'll see that while there's a slight bias to finds in the South County, actually most parishes have a good number of finds, and that's true as well for different periods. You'll see that with the purple graph you can see there, which flicks through by different time periods. And you can see there that actually it doesn't matter if you're looking at the Bronze Age, the early medieval period, or the Roman period. Actually, the distributions of finds are pretty consistent. Now, that's not too surprising. Oxfordshire is a relatively low-level county. There's not really any sort of fringe areas where settlement wouldn't want to exist, so it's what we'd expect. But it does mean that if we're wanting to do any landscape-based analysis, we need to go at a finer resolution than the parish level. So, to do that, we're going to need to look at the national grid references that we record with the Portable Antiquities Scheme. The way these work is we record grid references, which are usually at about 100-meter resolution or better. That means that we're defining grid squares, usually about 100 meters wide and 100 meters tall, and we're saying the find came from anywhere within that square. If we can get better resolution, we do. And what we can do is plot those zones of where we think the finds come from. You can see that on these graphs here. And if we stack those up by their different resolution and availability, you get what looks like in that third map, a series of circular dots all over the county. These represent zones where we know metal detecting is occurring because often metal detectors are going through whole fields rather than just one particular area. And so in some ways actually reflect the regions which have been metal detected, assuming finds worth recording have come through to us. So we can stack up those zones of metal detecting, excluding the areas which have very poor resolution. So any finds which, for example, come from a 10-kilometer grid square, and it gets a map which looks like this. And this is a bit more usable because it's got a bit more resolution than that parish map. Now, what's quite exciting is actually you can see there's vast swathes of Oxfordshire in this map where we have finds coming to us and that have been recorded. In fact, when you sum the areas covered by these boxes, it's just over 10% of the whole county of Oxfordshire. Now, with that map created, we can then do some clever analysis year by year, where we can say, well, any finds we recorded this year, did they come from an area where we didn't previously have finds? Now, I don't have time to go through every single year, the graphs in the top right of your screen there. But what's interesting is generally about 30% of our records are coming from areas where we haven't had a single find recorded on the PAS database in previous years. So that's fantastic. At least 1/3 of our finds are extending the distribution of the PAS's understanding of our landscapes. If you want to quantify that in terms of surface area, that's usually around about 9 square kilometres, which is about 0.5% of the county's area. So every year, that's going up. Those numbers understood, we can then compare those to the finds that are coming up through rallies. So looking at 2017, for example, when there were a large number of rallies in and around Oxfordshire, you can see those on the map here. We've mapped all of those finds and compared them to all the finds prior to 2017. And what you can see here is in the yellow dots are those regions where finds have been recorded, where there weren't previous finds that coming from before. Now, of the 991 findings, from 480 individual recorders, that's kind of mad, 301 of those were areas not identified before. So that's about 30%. It's about a similar number to what came before. So that raises an interesting question for us as FLOs, because it means that if we go to rallies, we are recording from more metal detectorists. They're from more geographically limited areas, as you can see on this map, but in general, those are still areas which don't have the same sort of proportion of finds as you see through more traditional methods. So that raises an interesting question for us, but I think emphasizes just quite how many finds we have. Now, hopefully, any of you who've been listening carefully will be saying, wait a minute, Ed, there's a problem here. You've been looking at all the finds from Oxfordshire. Is it really appropriate to say if you've got a site full of Roman coins and then find a Bronze Age axe in, say, 2020, that's not a new area extending the landscape? Well, you're dead on right. Of course it's not. We actually need to cut these out and divide these down by periods. I've not done this for this in-house because then that would extend the talk far, far longer. Instead, we're going to show you a second case study about how you can look at just one particular period of finds, in this case the Bronze Age, to better understand landscapes. Now, a full example of this paper is available on the Later Prehistoric Finds Group's YouTube channel. It's part of the research I've been doing into Bronze Age hoards. But summarising the method, I've been looking at, can we find hidden treasure in the Portable Antiquities Scheme database? And the answer is, absolutely we can. Looking at all the metalwork Bronze Age finds that we can find in Oxfordshire, we can identify 55 potential clusters of finds which haven't been identified before in the PAS database, in historic environment records, or other monographs to studying Bronze Age metalwork. Now, some of these clusters are quite small. They can be just 2 finds spread between 10 to 370 metres. But other of them can be quite large, between 10 and 20 finds spread between 90 metres or as far as 700 metres, which is quite exciting. But before we get too excited about that number, we have to say, well, what are these clusters and what do they represent? And to do this, we need to really understand them in their contextual landscape setting. So, for example, taking this map you can see here, which are simplified to keep the locations relatively anonymous. The little black dots you can see all represent Bronze Age round barrows, probably built in the early Bronze Age. Now, we have 2 finds indicated by the big red dots you can see here, one being a late Bronze Age socketed axe head, and another a little bit of a gold bar ingot, which you wouldn't expect to be buried together at the same time. So these don't represent a dispersed hoard. Instead, as a Bronze Age archaeology, you say, well, this represents repeated deposition in an existing ritual landscape. But if we look at the cluster of finds to the top left of that map, those 4 finds indicated by the spearhead, the sword fragment, a socketed axe fragment, and actually another piece of socketed axe hair, well, what does that suggest? Well, those are all pretty what you'd expect in a Ewart Park hoard, right at the end of a late Bronze Age. So we possibly do have a dispersed hoard there, or maybe continuing activity similar to those red finds. But perhaps more excitingly for me is the next landscape I'm going to show you. So this is an area which has been heavily metal detected. You can see all of those very light grey dots there on the map, indicating finds that have been recorded on the Portable Antiquities Scheme database. Those ones in colour, however, represent Bronze Age finds, and they're placed all around an Iron Age hill fort which has had proposed early Bronze Age, earlier late Bronze Age activity at that site. Now, these clusters are far too widespread to suggest that these are dispersed hoards. But then, so how do we interpret them? Well, they're probably related to the settlement in the local area. That's exciting for me as a Bronze Age specialist because it's very rare we get large metalwork assemblages associated with settlement. It's very rare we get a must farm, for example. So this seems like a new kind of assemblage which might help us pair up 2 data sets, in this case settlements, and with the PAS metalwork, which are rarely found together. And of course, we can find hoards as well. So this is quite a nice example here where we've got a large amount of Middle Bronze Age metalwork, all found very close together by a river. And actually some of the earliest Iron Age metalwork as well, which are those blue dots, possibly being buried in an area which they knew objects were meant to be buried in over a large period of time. Now, sometimes clusters aren't clusters at all. So here we have 3 Bronze Age items. Now, these are not dated to the same period in the Bronze Age. They're probably spread out over about 500 years, all near a river. So we have a cluster of finds, but they're not really sort of related directly to one another. Instead, they represent repeated deposition of items in an area over a period of time, similar to what you see, for example, at Flag Fen. But that's wonderful because while it's not a hoard which I'm wanting to study, it's a new landscape which hadn't been identified before. There were no Bronze Age sites within a mile of this recorded on the Historic Environment Record. So already those 55 clusters show us ways that we can identify new landscapes and new hoards in the PAS database which weren't recognised before. We can extrapolate this nationally by looking at the number of potential clusters in the PAS database, and that gets us to around about 450 new hoards and maybe 140, 150 new landscapes that we can understand, which haven't been studied in the PAS database before, and are ripe there for anybody who's wanting to do a study. To give you a sense of that scale, typically PhDs study about 300 things. So we've got 1.5 PhDs of potential Bronze Age study there, which is just waiting for one of you to go and tackle. Now, it's important at this point to say these clusters can't be automated. You can't just assess them using sort of computational methods. You need to look at them in their landscape context because often they provide the clue as to how those sites should be understood as. So, just to summarize, hopefully what I've shown you here is that the PS has recorded a huge amount of data. This is certainly true for Oxfordshire, where the finds are covering more than 10% of the surface area from the county. Recording does have some biases into the locations where they come from, but actually we've got a pretty even spread. Crucially, the scale of the database that we have now allows us to do some really exciting analyses where we can extend not just the size of our corpuses, but their distribution. And these allow us to identify new landscapes, which could be new hoards, they could be new ritual landscapes, or they could be entirely new assemblages not previously recognized. We do need a proper framework for understanding these. So I'm going to end my section of the presentation by throwing that out to yourselves, because my job is to record these finds. There's vast amounts of data potential in the PAS database, and it'd be wonderful to hear what you wanted to do with it. But before we do that, we're going to hand over to fantastic Finds Liaison Officer, which is Ben Westwood, who works for the Durham area. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks very much, Ed. That's a great lead in there with the framework keyword in there, because my unenviable task this evening is I'm going to catapult us forward just a couple of years into the post-medieval sort of Reformation period. I'll try and share my screen as well. Hang on. There we are. Hopefully you can all see that. I'm going to catapult forward a few years, and I'm going to try and make regional research frameworks interesting. So you can judge me on that at the end, perhaps in the chat box. But we talk a lot in PAS about our data. We've talked a lot about our data tonight and how proud we are of it when milestones are hit, whether that's 1 million records or 1.5 million finds, and quite rightly we celebrate that. And we talk about it, and we talk about how important it is that finds are recorded. But of course, you scratch that surface, what we're really talking about is the potential within that data, as Ed's been talking about, and as Rob's been talking about too.
Hey, we can't see your screen, sorry.
Ah, right. Well, that's a problem. It's showing up as, all right, I'll come out of it and try and, I'll unshare. Oh. What's going on here? So that one, and then share. Is it sharing now?
Yes.
Yes.
I don't know what happened there. It was telling me it was sharing. Right.
Presentation mode, then.
Oh, yep, that's coming. I do apologise.
That's it.
Brilliant. Well, I just skipped. There's a couple of slides before that. There we go. And then where were we? and so, yeah, the potential. I was talking about potential in the data, wasn't I? And that's something we explore quite often in the scheme, particularly in the research working group, how we can attract and engage researchers to use our data, whether that's independent researchers or for undergraduate dissertations, PhDs, bigger research projects, such as Rob was talking about with Warhorse. And we also want to think about how our data can be packaged almost to answer specific research questions. And so we've been discussing in the scheme how we can make that sort of our data collection, if you like, and the way we package that data more systematic, how we can feed into and reflect perhaps local or regional research priorities. And of course, regionality is a big thing in PAS. You know, we're all embedded in our regions, we get to know our finders and our communities. And so possibly the easiest way into presenting this data is, or one way anyway, is through regional research frameworks. And for the uninitiated, and I'm talking to the CBA here, so I'm sure there's nobody uninitiated out there, but just in case, regional research frameworks were what grew out of the challenges and changes in professional archaeology in the 1990s, PPG 16, commercial archaeology, all that stuff. Essentially, research frameworks help to regionally focus and systematic and objective based approaches to archaeological data collection, assessing what we know about our heritage and what we want to know, those known knowns and known unknowns, all that kind of stuff. And in the Durham, or in the northeast region, of course, we had, I've skipped ahead a bit too far. We had the shared visions, which is our hard copy research framework, published in 2006, involved lots of groups of shareholders. PAS was involved in its creation. But obviously these things need updating, and the most recent update over the last few years has been to combine all the regional research frameworks from the different regions of the country onto one website. It's like a wiki style kind of website that is easily editable and thus can be constantly updated. Obviously, you know, what we know about our heritage and our regions is constantly changing. And these can be updated through the Oasis and ADS, fabulous resource at York, with grey literature, and you can even answer specific research questions within the regional framework agendas. And I'm going to pick on the post-medieval agenda, as I said here. This is the Northeast Regional Research Framework. You can go and Google this afterwards and have a good look through it for your regions, wherever you are in England and Wales. And so with that in mind, in PAS, we've been thinking about how we might contribute to and draw from research frameworks to better understand and present our data. And the result of this, I think, is twofold. First of all, we can highlight those aspects and objects of material culture that are important in our regions, and possibly feed that back into the research frameworks. And secondly, and this really comes back to where we started, we want to make that data collection in some ways more systematic and more attuned to our regional priorities. And as I say, we're really well positioned then to present the research potential of data for further study in our regions. All flows kind of instinctively recognize those patterns and trends that emerge in the data and the finds in their area. We see classes and types of objects, distinct distributions, and within that recognize not only where we can add to existing corpuses of knowledge, but where those gaps perhaps in knowledge are, and even perhaps where those gaps haven't yet been recognized. And that's what I've been thinking about, and what I want to try and share with you is an example of how that might work. And it's very much in the sort of the initial stages at the moment, but as we go through this, I mean, this again is drawn from the post-medieval research agenda for the Northeast. We're thinking about these two questions within that research agenda, about social identities in the post-medieval period, and also about religion, belief and devotion in Northeast England in the Reformation and that early post-medieval period too. And I want you to particularly bear in mind this quote from NERF, from the Northeast Regional Framework, that cites form only one aspect of post-medieval archaeology. Much of the material culture of the later 16th, 17th centuries is unrelated to industrial archaeology, is not upstanding, and is not readily accessible. So skip over. So this is really important because religion and religious activity is, you know, obviously very important in every region. But the Reformation, as you may or may not, was a pretty big deal here in the Northeast. I think it was quite a big deal elsewhere in England as well. But certainly in the Northeast, we had a really special breed of recusancy and indeed recusants as well. And you may all be familiar with the famous Rising of the North in 1569, when the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland stormed Durham Cathedral and held a Catholic mass there, and then they estimate 6,000 armed men marched under the banner of the Five Wounds of Christ, and this kind of proceeded southwards and into Yorkshire, and lots of people joined this. But then as soon as Elizabeth and her council mustered an answering force of about 14,000, they say, this kind of rebellion quietly sort of fizzled away, or as it says, and even amongst the common people, rebellion amongst the common people quickly died down. And the result in the end was, of course, the execution of the Earl of Northumberland in York. Had his head lopped off there, as we can see in the lovely image. And hundreds of people were executed under Elizabeth's orders, and the North was put under pretty strict religious control. So that kind of neatly sums up that kind of historical side of the Northern Rebellion and that Reformation period. But that's the history, isn't it? And what we're interested in is the archaeology. How does that manifest archaeology? Does it manifest archaeologically? And what's the impact felt in terms of material culture? And what about this statement that rebellion amongst the common people quickly died down? Can we see that? And so I've been thinking about the coinage data to see if we can see any of this, those common objects. And it's an under-remarked fact, a remarkable fact, in fact, that after the coins of the House of Constantine, actually the most coins recorded for an individual ruler on the PAS database are those of Elizabeth I. Over 21,000, now approaching 22,000 individual coins for Elizabeth I. A lot of that's got to do with the fact that after the great debasement of the coinage by her father, Old Copper-Nose, as he's known, Elizabeth introduced a big reform of the coinage. But what's interesting is that amongst those 21,500 coins, there are many that have been intentionally damaged and defaced. And what do we mean by defaced? Well, you'll all be familiar with the famous, I'm sure, votes for women coins that were stamped, in the early 20th century. But the defacement of coins has a longer history than that, back to the Roman period. We've got a coin of Constantine there, a solidus of Honorius that's been defaced, and a lovely example there from William III, showing a bit of Jacobite rebellion there with a rather rude word scratched across the coin and his face completely rubbed out. So there's this long history of the defacement of coinage. What does that mean? And what do defaced coins from the Tudor period look like? Well, as you can see in this image here, so this is a coin of a sixpence rather of Elizabeth from 1586. So despite the fact that the legends are quite well preserved on the coin, the reverse of the coin with the shield is reasonably well preserved as well, the bust is completely missing. It really looks like there's been an intentional move to remove or rub away that bust. And in this coin too, from 1560, this shilling, not quite as well preserved around the edges, been a little bit clipped, but the legends are there, the reverse is there. We've got these very definite scratches within the center of the coin, and you'll see they adhere to that kind of inner circle. They're only across the bust is rubbed out again, and the bust has been removed and defaced. And again, with this one, again, an even rougher coin, this time this sixpence of 1582, but the reverse is really well preserved. Yet on the face is gone. There's lots of scratch marks, even X marks. I hope you can see those just about in that image. And even looks like someone's had a real go at it and pecked at it in this case as well, really expressing their personal opinion of Elizabeth. So, as I say, there's many examples of these defaced coins. But what's quite remarkable is that, as far as I can see, there's been very little study of post-medieval coins and defacing and damaging post-medieval coins in general, and no research that I can find anyway, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, but no research that I can find that have looked at the defacement of Elizabethan coins and what that might mean. When we look at the PAS data, the results are quite patchy. There's only over 100 or so coins actually have in the description of these coins mention that they've been defaced or rubbed or scratched. That's probably to do with the way that they're recorded, and they're scattered across the country. I suspect there's many more in the data there to be identified, and that needs cleaning up. As you can see, there's a bit of a bias there in Durham. We'll zoom in a bit to that. As Michael mentioned earlier, he talked about detectorist biases. This is recorder bias here, because we've, since we started to notice this phenomenon a few years ago, are intentionally making sure our records contain reference to these debased coins in the record itself. But what we can see, even in this kind of preliminary data, is that where we get these clusters of coins, and the red dots there, and that's obviously where detectorists are going, where they're collecting coins and where they're detecting and finding coins rather of Elizabethan period. Where we get these clusters of coins, there will always be one or two examples or a few examples of defaced coins in those assemblages, which is really, really interesting. So there's some work to do. The images of the coins in the database need to be re-examined, as I say. Defaced coins need to be identified, and we might need to think about how they're defaced, and is it how the actual process of defacing the coins, how do they compare to other coins from the period of unpopular rulers like Mary or Charles I, perhaps. But like I said previously, at this stage, it's about that research potential. But this act of defacing a coin, it really comes back to those research questions in the Northeast regional frameworks. These are the acts of the common people. They're acts of rebellion and subversion reflected in the material culture. And it doesn't stop at 1569 when that rebellion is defeated either. As those coins show, it continues. But as so often happens in portable antiquities, just as we were starting to think about these coins and this period and this period of rebellion, we had another object land on our desk, a piece of treasure last year, very serendipitously, that slots perfectly into this little story that I'm telling. So these are pyxes, these are pyx, medieval vessels or containers for containing the Eucharist or the sacraments. But when during Elizabeth's reign, these pyxes and a lot of this church silverware was, unsurprisingly, explicitly banned, pretty much from 1559 onwards, and so people started to make what's called recusant silver objects, little objects that could be easily hidden around your person and kept away from public view, but maintain your private faith in the old religion. Now, the object in the top left here is a very famous pyx, the Blundell pyx. There's another pyx that's been recorded. There's only one on the PAS database, and that's this one that was found near Preston in Lancashire. Well, there was only one until recently, because now we have this example that was found near a town called Lanchester in County Durham. And that's around 10 miles or so west of County Durham. We only have that top disc of it, as you can see. But what we found through our research is that Lanchester it really was a hotbed of little rural town in County Durham, but was a hotbed for recusancy, and even attracted the attention of the Bishop of Durham in that period, Toby Matthew, who wrote from Bishop Auckland Palace in 1598 about this dangerous place at some length. He was particularly concerned with certain great recusant ladies who he is informed keep bad rule both spiritually and carnally in their houses, and particularly at Christmas, he notes. And the bishop had recently discovered that one had remarried, presumably in some awful papist ceremony, to a very special recusant in that area, and apparently they all dwelleth in a certain house that we have the name of just outside the town. And amazingly, it was virtually in the grounds of this house, just over the back wall of this house, that this small or part of this partial silver pyx was found. So we're linking together that history and archaeology, and what's really exciting is bringing together these coins, these objects, and that history, that archival research, and weaving that story together to tell a story of recusant Durham in those periods. And if we think back to the research questions from NERF, we do have that potential to shed light using material culture on these personal identities of the people, common people, slightly more sort of middle class people who were these papists in Lanchester as well, and we can really begin to tell that story. So much so that myself and my colleague in Durham, Caroline Smith, were intending to carry on this story, and we're trying to build a small research project around this. And so, as I say, this is very much the initial stages, but hopefully that demonstrates how we can use local research priorities to begin to build on some of these themes and answer some of these questions regionally. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Wow. Thank you, Ben.
Stop
Thank you,
sharing.
Ed. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Michael. Can I ask, gents, if you can put your cameras back on? That was amazing. That was just like so much information. Truly brilliant. We've got some questions in the Q&A, which is absolutely fantastic. I just want to say, just for a start off, thank you. The breadth of what you covered there is really quite enormous, but you also all managed to go in to an incredibly niche little bit of the sort of area. And I suppose my reflection on what I like about you, what you do, is whilst you're recording the totality, you're really playing great games at investigating very niche personal interests. And that's the best thing about, for me, this data set, is that you can play it in many, many ways. So I just want you to, when we go through the questions, sort of reflect on those things. The question is why did you get into this? What was your spark that actually made you have that idea? And maybe I could put that question to you to start off with, each of you to really answer. What was it that drew you to this area of activity? Michael, do you want to kick off with that question?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, in terms of my kind of research interest that I have in the medieval period in particular, a bit like Rob, I guess here, we're on the same page pretty much on this, is that, yeah, I mean, I guess when I started working for the Portable Antiquities Scheme, I wasn't really completely aware of what kind of treasures, if you like, in another way of using that word that I know you don't particularly like, Neil, but anyway, there's little nuggets of information in that you kind of go down these kind of like rabbit holes, if you like, exploring, and you can see from the conversations that Ed and Ben and Rob have gone through, you can see their kind of personal interest sort of shining through in exploring that data. So yes, certainly for me, I think when you start looking at the data, you start to see things that, oh, has anybody thought about this? Like Ben was saying about the kind of recoussant sort of activity. Have people think about it? It seems obvious sometimes when you look at these things that somebody must have explored it before, but then you kind of realize no one really has, because people have been focused on a different sort of archaeology than this public archaeology that we deal with. Not really sure I've answered your question, but anyway, that's what I like about the data so much. I mean, and also, the kind of information it holds. And like you say, it is a storytelling exercise, isn't it, most of the time?
Brilliant. Rob, same question to you.
I came to it knowing very, very little about archaeological artifacts and found myself learning so much about so many different interesting things, despite having this interest in the medieval period. And as Michael said, that there's so much kind of potential we can unlock within this database that you spot just by kind of going through and playing with the data. So that's what draws me to the data now. At the time working for the scheme, I think one of the most fulfilling things was working with my volunteers, Ed being one of them back in the day. So and kind of training people and showing them this wealth of information and interesting objects and gateways into the past.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob. Ed, how about yourself?
So I suppose for me, there's two sides of things. So the Bronze Age one's a bit of an obvious one. That's what my PhD's in. I'm passionate about the Bronze Age. And then starting working with the PAS, I thought, oh, this is a fun job. So carried on. And then when you start working with the PAS database, you start realizing how much potential there is in there. So I'm interested at the moment in joining up settlements to metalwork and realizing, oh, well, are there any extra hoards in this database? And yeah, it looks like there's actually a huge number in there. And there's lots of other interesting questions you can ask when it comes to Bronze Age metalwork with this database, which I think the thing that makes it different is you've got all the pictures there, all that data and all the high quality findspo information, which is actually quite hard to get at when you're dealing with like museum catalogs, for example. So when with your passion, you suddenly think, oh gosh, there's so much data here, which you could only dream of in other sorts of situations. With the other part of the paper, though, what drew me to that was essentially making sure that we're doing a good job. Because actually, my experience with a lot of metal detectorists is when you can prove that you're being helpful to them, they're really grateful to record and they want to record with you. So basically, when we're looking at sort of how can we be most productive, it's all about sort of making ourselves most visible and make sure we're covering them a large number of people possible. Because that way we're sort of getting more jigsaw puzzle pieces for our future studies.
Brilliant. That's a great answer, Ed. And finally, Ben.
Yeah, I'm glad everybody in your answers sort of mentioned that potential. thing, because that's what I was really trying to draw out, is that potential in the data is just huge. There's so much stuff there that's just it's such an untapped resource, really, all of this. And I think what's, Rob mentioned working with volunteers. That's really rewarding part of the job is working with volunteers, but also building those connections with the finders of these objects. And what I found, I fell into this kind of research about I'm not a post-medievalist by any stretch of the mean, at all, but I kind of fell into this because it just jumped out at us from the data. It's screaming at us, really. But when I start to talk to detectorists about this and talk to them about how their coins can contribute to this, and then they start saying, oh, well, we've got, I find loads of Elizabeth coins, but they're always, I never bother bringing in and recording the ones that are, really damaged and stuff, because you don't want to see those. You only want to see the good examples where the bust's really crisp. And I kind of go through this and explain, well, no, actually, we want to see all of them so that we can look at all that data. And then when I explain this to them, so I had a group of 3 detectorists come in a couple of weeks ago for a morning where they brought in a load of coins they collected from their club, and we that previously unrecorded, that some of them were found 20 odd years ago, that they didn't, even though I go to see this club on a every 3 months, they didn't think the flow would want to see. So I had this influx of bias in the data again in Durham with this influx of coins. But that's great, when you can, like Ed said, you can talk to people and sort of explain how important these things are, and then they recognize it. And particularly when you're talking about it regionally and about the history in their backyard, in their back gardens and in their area, it really means something to people, and it's great to be able to be part of that.
Brilliant. Right, I'm going to jump onto the Q&A now, and the questions sort of group slightly. So everybody, if I amalgamate some of your questions, please forgive me. But what I want to just start with is Portable Antiquities Scheme north of the border. So Alison asks, is there something similar in Scotland? And then we also had a question from Kate about other countries having similar schemes. Michael, could you answer those for us, please?
Yeah, so there isn't a Portable Antiquities Scheme north of the border, simply because it's mandatory to record all archaeological objects from Scotland. So they have what they call the Treasure Trove Unit, which is, I suppose, like PAS in some respects, apart from it's probably more like us just doing treasure work all the time, which I think, looking at the Finds Liaisons, I think that would be a bit of a nightmare, to be honest, to do treasure hunt 24/7. But essentially, everything has to be reported, and there's a team of people in the National Museum of Scotland who do that work of processing those finds. In terms of other countries, Europe is pretty much of a mixed bag, really. I'd say that the most similar countries to us in Europe are probably Denmark, who have a what they call Danafe. So it's kind of more like Scotland in some respects, where there's a high number of objects that are classified as treasure and have to be sort of reported. The Netherlands, I suppose, is the most like us in terms of having a more voluntary approach to recording most of the archaeological finds, although detecting it's kind of licensed in a way. I mean, it's a kind of a newbie in a way. In general, I think you can broadly say that there's a kind of Northern European zone, which is kind of, I would say, relatively liberal in terms of its approach to metal detecting, is allowed. Southern Europe, where it's mostly prohibited, and that includes the Republic of Ireland as well, of course. And then Eastern Europe, where you kind of got a blend between the two, mostly because there's perhaps, and I think some of my colleagues from Central Europe would frown on me for slightly saying this, but there's probably a sense of lack of enforcement of either the law regarding people reporting their finds and the mechanisms for doing that as well. So it's a real mixed bag, actually, out there in terms of the approach towards metal detecting, whether it's banned, whether it's allowed in some part, or whether it's regulated against to a degree, or whether it's almost a bit of a free-for-all.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, next set of questions is going to be all around volunteering. So we've had a few questions about, is it possible to actually volunteer as a finds recorder if you aren't a detectorist? So we know that the PAS scheme has finds recorders located around the country, but how might people volunteer to do in a supporting role around that? And then allied to that, one question is there any scope for actually working with the metal detectorist clubs to actually make one of their members sort of responsible for recording? And then jumping onto that, are you looking at ways to develop a mobile app that can help people detect, well, not detect, identify the finds and record the finds?
Yeah, who's best to start with that? I mean, shall I say some bits and then other people will sort of add in, really? Is
That's a really great idea.
That's probably I can't remember what the first question was now. That was
So the
about
first part was,
yeah.
can volunteers help you out?
Yeah. Essentially, the best thing really to do is if people want to volunteer with the PAS is to contact their local finds liaison officer in the area that they live. On the ground, and I'll let Ed and Ben probably best to reply to this. I mean, that does vary from area to area, whether they can, you know, if they have the kind of the mechanisms to do that, really. So some organisations, because all of the finds liaison officers work for different organisations, some of those organisations find it easier to accommodate volunteers than others. And you know, the finds liaison officer has to sort of fit in with that. That's probably fair to say, isn't it, Ed and Ben? Probably. Yeah. In terms of it's a very interesting idea about how do we engage with metal detecting groups. In some clubs that I know of, there are people that kind of take this sort of central role, either a bit like I think Ben was inferring, they work with their other finders in bringing finds in for recording. So that sometimes happens because obviously it's hard for people in the week or sometimes at the weekend even to kind of to fit in with what the finds liaison officer's kind of working pattern is. So sometimes they work with other people like that. There are some clubs where they do have people who are kind of, if you like, what they call club recorders. The thing is, it's not all clubs nowadays. There's a lot of individuals as well out there. So I think that's changed significantly over the last kind of 10, 15 years, actually. So there's a lot more individuals. I mean, what I was talking about in my talk really is that I'm quite keen that individuals work with people to explore their local landscape. So, you know, have that support, if you like. So obviously there's some people who are really up for recording their own finds and other people that's something they really don't really feel comfortable doing or don't want to do. And so there I think there's a big opportunity for support. And in terms of the app, the National Council for Metal Detecting, for example, does have an app, a recording app that allows people to record find spot information and images as well, which could be passed on to the finds liaison officers. But there's others out there as well. It's not the only application that could be used. We probably won't develop that ourselves directly with the Portable Antiquities Scheme because of the other ones that we can kind of link with, we think. But I don't know if there's anything people feel that I've kind of missed that want to add to that, because I'm sure I've just skimmed over a little bit.
Should I talk about the volunteering side of things a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, the answer is volunteering. It is sort of regionally specific depending on the flow's conditions. But in Oxfordshire, we love volunteers essentially because it means we can record more finds. And in terms of getting in touch, I mean, basically we say to just contact your local flow and start a conversation because often we can kind of accommodate people depending on our workload. So just to give you an example, in Oxfordshire, we've done, for example, 3-week student placements with master's students and undergraduate students. We have one regular volunteer who comes in and basically does typical finds recording. So we've trained them up and they're really good, like, you know, fantastic on things like shot, buckle, Roman coins, that sort of thing. We've been in chats with another person who's really keen on doing some object photography. So we can offer those skills basically around my calendar and there. So it's always nice to have volunteers, basically.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a nice question that leads on from that from Gulfreem Chowdhury, who asks, whilst they can understand why training metal detectors and volunteers sounds like the right thing to do, what happens to fresh graduates who want to get into finds processing but don't have enough experience? We keep hearing we need more specialists, but who's going to actually train them?
Again, do you mind if I tackle that one first, Michael, and then you come in? So just as a sort of background, so my background wasn't in finds when I started working with the PAS. Actually, my PhD, my master's, that was all studying sites, particularly burials and settlements. I did a bit of volunteering with the Portable Antiquities Scheme while I was studying up in Durham, actually, and then a little bit when I was sort of looking for a job as well when I was in Somerset. So that's when I volunteered with Rob. And there's often usually finds liaison assistant posts. So I was lucky enough to get one of those in Somerset and realised, oh, I quite enjoy that job. And actually doing that volunteering with the PAS is a really good way of getting that first-hand finds experience. I certainly learnt loads. I think one of the sort of sort of, one of the values, actually, one of the lucky things as a flow, one of the privileges is the sheer quantity of finds that get brought to us and their variety provides you a real hands-on experience of knowing the route ways into object identification, which on my side, I didn't necessarily get during my undergraduate, for example. So volunteering with the PAS is a great way of getting those skills, I think, if you're looking to go into that finds route.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, I think like Rob said, there's, none of us have come into this job knowing loads about finds at all. We've built that knowledge on the job. When I became a finds liaison officer, it was in the very early days when there was hardly any people that knew anything about anything. So I think the standards have improved significantly since then. And as Ed says, I mean, a lot of people now who kind of come into the scheme usually have been volunteering alongside a finds liaison officer, take up one of these kind of introductory posts, I suppose, that we have as well, to get their kind of knowledge base up to compete for these jobs, because nowadays there is a bigger core. I mean, and as your kind of the question was sort of asked, really, I think in universities traditionally, although there might be a bit of time for finds, it's not enough really to build up the knowledge that you need to be able to do this job. In fact, to start with, of course, the detectorists definitely know loads more than us about the finds, and then we start to compete gradually as we've done several years in the job.
Yeah, there is a lot to learn there, and indeed some of the questions are also looking at that relationship. So Carol, talks about being part of a volunteer group with a local heritage centre, and is really interested in how they might start gathering information or helping out with that process. And in some ways, actually getting them familiar with the Portable Antiquities Scheme database is a great way to actually start that conversation. That group, you've talked really well about broadening those volunteers out who might actually be able to have that conversation. And that, I think, was what you're actually speaking to in terms of Carol's question. Nikki asks, are you actually going to involve the PAS explorers in helping out the usability uplift of the database?
Yeah, so I mean, where we're at the moment is we've chosen a sort of developer, if you like, that's going to be rebuilding the Portable Antiquities Scheme database, and we're certainly involving lots of different stakeholder groups in how that sort of goes. I mean, obviously, it's really important, as I kind of expressed in my talk, that we make the most of the new technology that exists in order to record as many finds as possible. We can't possibly record all of those finds alone, and I think giving as many people as possible the potential to learn about finds and be involved in the recording process is not only useful, like I said, for us in terms of recording more finds, but I think hopefully it will, people who want to get involved with that, it'll upskill them essentially. And we've got some really fantastic examples of detectorists and other volunteers who, have kind of worked alongside us, and it might only be a part of the process as well that they're interested in, for example. So there's been people that would just like to do the kind of photography side. Some people want to do the kind of weighing and measuring. That's sort of what they want to do. Some people want to do everything, but there's other aspects, I think, as well. And one bit that we haven't really talked about is the kind of exploring new sites, and how does that go about, and what is the role for other people to be involved, working alongside metal detectorists to help them explore the sites that they search.
Yeah, brilliant. Right. Okay, so I've just got a few questions that slightly intercede and link in around how the data is used and how people again might actually take part in that process. So Anna, who actually does some recording with Ben in Durham, wants to know how the flow of information can go the other way a little bit better. So back to them. And Jonathan asks, is the past data used in the planning process? And if not, why not? Who wants to have a go at those?
Go on, Ben, you start since you're with the
it is. You can correct me, Michael, when I get it wrong, but it is. Yeah, it is used in the planning process. So most the data, if you look at the PAS database, you'll see a little button that says something like export for HERs or HER export or something like that. So that most HERs will export the data usually on about a 12 monthly cyclical basis and input that data into local HERs. How they make that data available then to people who consult the HER varies from region, from area, from local authority to local authority, I guess. Some will just, if you did a 500 meters or kilometer search, on a particular site, they'll say, well, there's PAS finds in that area, but that's all we can tell you. Others will give you pretty much tell you exactly where everything is in that area. It's something we've talked about in the past, haven't we, Michael, about how we should maybe better engage with contractual units and things like that, and how we can present the data in a bit of a better way. But certainly it is part of the planning process, and also it's part of the forestry process as well now. So with a lot of the trees that have been planted, and this is quite a recent thing where huge tree planting projects are ongoing at the moment, I should understand, with the climate crisis and everything else. So more and more areas need to be checked for archaeological potential before that planting process takes place. And so we've made our data available to the Forestry Commission as well, so that they can be checked in a similar way to the development process can be checked before woodland is planted. So yeah, it's definitely been consulted. How widely it's used by development archaeologists and commercial units, I don't know. So.
I was just going to add in terms of HERs. I mean, they do use the data they do import the data in different ways. So some, as Ben says, try and import it into the HERs, and others, they use it as a separate layer alongside the HER.
Yeah.
I think most will consult it as part of development control to see how the PS data adds to what is already known about archaeological sites. What we're very clear about is how that data is then provided onto third parties, because as you've kind of probably picked up in what we've been talking about already, the detector community in particular is very sensitive about who has access to that data. And there's two main reasons for that. One is the kind of threat of night hawking, and so archaeological sites sort of being damaged by that. And obviously other detectorists knowing about where they're kind of searching and finding lots of information. So whilst we want to share that data as widely as possible, that's always at the back of our mind about, how do we, reassure detectorists that information isn't getting into the wrong hands, essentially. That's, I suppose, the way I would sort of phrase it. So with historic environment records and other third-party researchers, we do have kind of, if you like, terms and conditions about how that data is used thereafter to ensure that kind of preservation of those sites is there, and people are encouraged to record as many finds as possible. I've got to say, though, it is becoming more and more of a tricky sort of subject, because obviously as we've kind of demonstrated, a lot of detectorists are really interested in learning more about the landscapes that they search, and they would quite be interested to know who else has been searching there and how that kind of fits with the sites that they're working on. So it is a sort of tricky area, but at the moment the view is that we have to be quite cautious about how that data is shared outside to other detectorists, essentially. But I think most of the detectorists I've spoken to kind of understand that, because obviously they have those initial concerns themselves about who has access to the data. So essentially they don't mind archaeologists or other researchers having that information. They're just worried about other detectorists, generally speaking.
Brilliant. You actually touched on a question that Debbie had asked, was how do we actually try and improve that relationship, because of the sensitivities about them not necessarily wanting people to know where they're actually working? How do we get an element of trust there? We're going beyond time now, so unfortunately I'm not going to be able to ask any more of the questions. We do have about another 5 that what I'll do is, Michael, I'll share with you, and then if we can do a written response to them if you want, and share them around the group here. That they're all really brilliant. And I think the main thing that actually comes out of it is, how do we take that conversation forward about having a more broader conversation with metal detectorists, local history groups, local societies, about the places people are actually operating in. Yeah, and actually get the conversation about why are we actually interested in these places, because that's, for me, the one big area we just don't actually necessarily talk about in this. Everything quickly goes to the find, where actually if we talked about the landscapes, I think we could find there's an awful lot of interest that we can actually draw in there. I do have one last question, which I think has to be for Ben, which is it always possible to tell if a coin defacing was deliberate?
Well, there's the question, Neil. We've got to think about it. Somebody, I won't name who, suggested perhaps I should get a hold of a load of Elizabethan coins and rub them to see, to do some experimental archaeology. But I'm not sure about the ethics of that, so we'll have to see. Yeah, I agree. It will, like all things in heritage and archaeology, a lot of it will come down to somebody's opinion, and there'll be other opinions that probably disagree with that. But I think there's enough there to say that, because of the way these coins are damaged, there's something else going on with them that's just not just normal wear and tear processes. And part of that is that reform of the coinage and the silver content, which I didn't go into tonight, but the silver content of the coins, that they're a little bit softer than they had been previously because the silver content is higher than under Henry VIII and Edward VI. But yeah, it is difficult to tell. But this is part of what we'd like to do in our research project, is start to think about a more systematic way of identifying these coins.
Brilliant. Right, everybody on the call, we're about to just launch a very quick poll, just to ask you how you felt everything went this evening. If you could stay on and finish that poll whilst I go round and do my thanks to everyone who's been involved tonight. So first of all, Ben, Michael, Ed, Rob, I just want to thank you all for giving up your time. I'm really appreciative of coming and actually talking about this. There clearly is more than one evening we could spend talking about the ins and outs of these conversations. And I think we can definitely take away some of those conversations, because it'd be lovely to do this again. I think that connection of talking about the scheme to the CBA audiences, you mentioned it earlier, Michael, I think it's a really good combination that we need to do more about, actually bringing those conversations into the debate. Everybody on the Zoom call, thank you very much for attending. We will also email you a questionnaire and evaluation form for this evening's event. Please do fill that out. The CBA online events are free to attend, so if you are feeling generous, please do go onto the CBA website, and again, the links will all be put in the chat, and give us a donation if you want to. Or even better, during the Festival of Archaeology, CBA membership is half price, so you can get membership for a bargain price of £23.25, I think it is. So please do go on to the CBA website and become a member. It means we can actually host more events like this. It means we can make the Festival of Archaeology even better. Now, if you haven't got your full of archaeological discussions, tomorrow is Ask an Archaeologist Day. So if you are on the social media platform X, formerly known as Twitter, please do watch out for Ask an Archaeologist Day. It is probably the most hectic day in the calendar of the archaeologist world. I will be starting at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, welcoming people onto Twitter and getting them to actually ask their questions to the Twitter hive mind of archaeologists that will be out there answering questions. So please do that. It'll go from 8 a.m. tomorrow till 6 p.m. tomorrow. A whole host of CBA staff are going to be involved, a whole host of National Trust staff. Again, we know individuals from the Portable Antiquities Scheme will be there on watching the questions online to actually help you answer any questions you've got. The Festival of Archaeology continues to run all the way through to the 28th of July. So if you're looking for something to do, please go onto the CBA website, find an event near you, get along to that event and take part. The CBA will be hosting another online lecture next week called Roots in Time, which will be on Tuesday, the 23rd of July. On Monday, the 22nd, we'll be also hosting a debate amongst the 7 national amenity societies. So they are the Georgian Group, the Victorian Society, the Council for British Archaeology, the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, the 20th Century Society, the Gardens Trust, and I'm missing one, Historic Buildings and Places. We all have a role in the planning process, and it's your chance to come and find out what we actually do and pose some questions to us. So lots of activities in the festival. Thank you all very much for taking part. Thank you for doing the poll, which was fantastic. Please fill out the evaluation form. And if you just want to, in the chat, thank all of our speakers who've been absolutely brilliant tonight. Gents, we will copy you the chat so you can see all the thanks from everyone. There's absolutely some brilliant comments in there. So thank you very much indeed. Everybody, I hope you all have a safe evening, safe journey back to your homes, even if that's moving from a table to your sofa. Please look after yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you at the next CBA event. Many thanks, everybody, and goodbye.